Welcome back, guys. So today we're talking about one that's pretty awesome to me. I've always been a Street Fighter fan, always, since it was first introduced in the arcade many years ago. Street Fighter 2 has been released multiple versions over and over again across numerous platforms. But today we're going back, way back, looking at a port that was never released on its hardware in the US. And what game is that? Street Fighter 2 Champion Edition for the PC Engine. So this came out, and here's the box. Kind of looks pretty cool. Thick box. Has a nice little instruction manual, goes over a bunch of moves and stuff. Full color manual, by the way. Little warranty card and whatnot. Pretty awesome stuff. But this was released way back, '93 in Japan, where a lot of other ports were coming out as well for the Super Nintendo, Mega Drive, Genesis, stuff like that. But what I find interesting with this game for the PC Engine, not only that it never came out in the US, but that Street Fighter 2 Champion Edition wasn't released in its original form on the Super Nintendo or the Sega Genesis. So this essentially was probably the most complete version of the game at the time, because prior to that it was just Street Fighter 2, the original version. Champion Edition did come out on a couple other consoles, but not in the US. It did come out on the Master System from Tectoy in Brazil, kind of a gimped version. Wasn't really Champion Edition, but that's what it was branded as. And where this came out on the Super Nintendo and the Sega Genesis, they were not called Champion Edition, other than the Sega Genesis version was called Special Champion Edition. But what it essentially was Street Fighter 2 Turbo. Street Fighter 2 Turbo for the Super Nintendo did have Champion Edition and the Turbo modes built into it, which was kind of cool. But at the time, Champion Edition for the PC Engine was the most complete version of Street Fighter 2. Prior to that, we did have Street Fighter 2 for the Super Nintendo or Super Famicom, and it was missing some stuff. They gimped it a little bit. There were some graphics that they removed from the game, some voiceover work that they removed from the game. The barrel bonus stage was removed from the game, and it was later put back onto, Street Fighter 2 Turbo and later incarnations of the game. But this version was the most complete at the time, and I find that pretty cool. Now, this never came out in the US for a couple reasons. One, the TurboGrafx 16 did not do very well in the US. We actually got less than 100 games released here, so the sales weren't great. And there were also some licensing issues that I had read about to where it kind of, stifled this from coming out over here. But I thought that would have been pretty awesome if we had this for the TurboGrafx 16. That could have been a system seller, but unfortunately never happened. We did eventually get this exact game released in the US, but it was a Wii Virtual Console game released in 2009. Pretty cool. So obviously you could play this version of the game numerous ways. On original hardware, PC Engine, you could play it on the TurboGrafx 16 with a Turbo EverDrive, or if you have a modified system, or if you have the adapter to play Japanese games on a TurboGrafx. Or you could play the ROM on RetroPie, on your Raspberry Pi or your Odroid, whatever you want to check it out on. But I think it is a pretty cool game to peep out. So looking back at the PC Engine TurboGrafx 16, I thought it would be cool to peep this version of the game out for a couple reasons. So we just mentioned that the TurboGrafx kind of failed here, but it was called the TurboGrafx 16, right? A little deceiving because the system wasn't really a 16-bit system. It was kind of a hybrid 8-bit, 16-bit. It was kind of a souped up, hyper 8-bit system. So originally TurboGrafx PC Engine had an 8-bit CPU and a 16-bit GPU, processors. So kind of interesting. And there's a few more facts that I find kind of interesting as well. Color palettes, that's something I wanted to mention. The PC Engine, instead of saying PC Engine TurboGrafx every time, I'm just going to say PC Engine from here on out. The color palette had 512 colors that they could select from. Sounds kind of low, but not really comparing to a few other systems that were out at the time. But the interesting thing is if you look, the Sega Genesis had this, similar color palette, 512. The Genesis, though, did have an extended color palette, but it was used for transparencies and background colors. So we're just going off of the base color palette. So they both shared similar, a similar amount of colors that they could use. But the PC Engine could display 482 at one time. That is simply amazing to me. Yeah, the palette was a little limited at 512. Not necessarily compared to the Sega Genesis, other than the expanded palette that it did have. But looking at the Super Nintendo had over 32,000 colors that it could display. Not at one time, but you could choose from. The Super Nintendo could display 256 at one time. That's pretty amazing, but it's almost half as less than what the TurboGrafx could display, or the PC Engine, my bad. So the interesting thing I find with that is it appears, due to the hardware kind of being a dual system, kind of right in the middle, not exactly 8-bit, not exactly 16-bit, that some of the design choices with this kind of gimped it a little bit, even though it did have an awesome range of colors it could display. But you also, you didn't get the parallax scrolling and stuff like that. Throughout the years looking at this system and the games that play on it, there's always that aesthetic of, it's a TurboGrafx or PC Engine game. Very bright, very colorful, but kind of limited at the same time. I can't really I'm sure there are, but from my knowledge, I can't really think of a game that really fully utilized 482 colors at once. But the games did look good. They were bright, they were colorful, big, sprites. Really awesome stuff for the time. But I just think those design decisions there kind of stifled that a little bit compared to the Super Nintendo anyway, with all the different modes that it supported and graphic styles that you could get out of it and little tricks that they utilized. So that's where we're at. So the thing I think also that's interesting with this game is, if you remember, PC Engine only had 2 buttons, right? Pretty much, there's the start and select, or it's select and run, which essentially select and start, and then a 1 and 2 button, which essentially A and B. So you only had 2 action buttons. For Street Fighter 2 for the PC Engine, you would use the run button, which essentially start, as your low punch or low kick, and then 2 as your medium, and 1 as your high. And you would press select to swap between punches or kicks. I don't care what anybody says, that's awkward and crazy. I can't play the game that way. You can, but it's just not what I'm accustomed to. So at the same time when this was released in Japan, NEC did release the Avenue Pad 6-button controller. Awesome. I love 6-button face, controllers that have 6 face buttons to play these fighting games. So this was released exclusively for Street Fighter 2 in Japan. Pretty similar to when Street Fighter 2 Special Champion Edition for the Sega Genesis made its way out, around that time. They pushed for a 6-button controller for the Genesis. So it was really, these fighting games that caused that innovation of getting, 6 buttons for controllers that didn't have 6 buttons. But yeah, this is to me the only way to play this game on the PC Engine. And after this came out, we did get the Hori Commander, and there was a little arcade stick as well. So like I said, only way to play it. I don't see it being that fun with a 2-button controller, but it is what it is. So today I figured it'd be kind of cool, plug this bad boy in and check out some Street Fighter 2 Champion Edition on the PC Engine. So without further ado, let's get this party started. Okay guys, we got this bad boy plugged in. Give her a little test run. So my PC Engine is RGB modified. I am running this through SCART on the OSSC at line ×3. My recordings, capture cards will not capture anything higher than that, so that's why I never record in anything beyond 3 times. And on my TV, anything above 3 times does not display properly. It's something I'm still learning about, but I think the 3 times lines for all these classic systems looks pretty legit for me. So as you see, we do have our extended character selection for the Champion Edition here. Colorful, looks amazing to me, pretty crisp, but as you can see, though the backgrounds are not static, they don't have that additional scrolling going on. So the graphics are a little gimped in that regard. But like I also said, there's some things that were removed from the first port on the Super Nintendo and were included in this, with some of the voiceover stuff. The barrel bonus stage, a couple of the actual fighting stages had some of the animations and artwork reinstated, whereas in the Super Nintendo version they were not there. So that's pretty cool to me. Some people, want to say this is the ultimate version. I think, yeah, maybe for Champion Edition, for a straight port of that version of the game, I could see that. But definitely for me, the Super Nintendo version, if it's not the arcade version, Street Fighter 2 Turbo or Hyper Fighting was pretty amazing. Super Street Fighter 2 is awesome. And for me, those all blow this out the water. But obviously those were extended versions that had additional features to them, whereas this is kind of going way back. This is almost Street Fighter 2 version 2, whereas the other ones were version 3, 4, 5, 6, that kind of thing. But I still find it very interesting and cool to go back and play these console ports of this awesome arcade game. I mean, this is, there was the first Street Fighter, but the game was kind of weak. I actually played that in the arcade and was like, what the heck is this? Like, this isn't that amazing. It was kind of neat, but at the same time, it was real sluggish and weird. Whereas Street Fighter 2 was more fluid and animated and more moves you could do and everything you could pull off easier than the first Street Fighter game. So for its time, this to me really set off that arcade boom of fighting games. There were so many games that came out after this, so many sequels to Street Fighter 2, so many versions of Street Fighter 2. It was just an amazing time. And for this system, I am using that Avenue Pad 6, and the only real criticism I can give this controller, it feels fine in my hands, don't get me wrong. The D-pad does feel a slight bit smaller than what I'm accustomed to on other systems from around that time period, but it's still very responsive, very easy to do your rolling motions and things like that. And the actual button placement of the 6 face buttons is very natural, feels very good, not hard to figure out where you're pressing, what button you're hitting. You're not going to accidentally hit the wrong button on this thing. They feel very responsive and do what they need to do. Now, obviously, a lot of these, most NEC controllers had turbo functionality, this one included. But for a game like this, I don't really see myself ever needing to use turbo. So I'm not using it, you know what I'm saying? And in reality, is this an awesome port? I think so. I think if this would have came out for the TurboGrafx 16 in the US, this could have been a system seller. Maybe not making the TurboGrafx like a top-selling system or anything like that, but I think it might have been worth Capcom in NEC's while to release this. I think they, especially if this would have been released before Street Fighter 2 Turbo, this really could have pushed out some consoles at that time for the TurboGrafx 16. It's really a solid port. Some graphics issues aside, I wouldn't even call them issues, just limitations anyway. You are getting the background animations and whatnot, but the multiple layers are not going to be there. And to me, that's fine. I mean, the game plays well, responds well, and it's awesome to relive the past and play these awesome games. And Street Fighter 2 is one of them that I just simply can't get enough of. Always playing Street Fighter 2 on some system or another. It's just an awesome, easy to play, quick time waster. Pick up and play, get in a few matches, do some competitive stuff, or just play the game, against the computer. And this is really awesome. I think if you're a PC Engine collector, this is definitely one worth adding to your collection. Very cheap, not a pricey game. Complete in the box, I would say I've seen them going for anywhere between 20 to 30 bucks. Cue card only, probably half of that price. It's really cool to have this piece of history of a game that this version wasn't really released in this form on many systems, and not on any system in the US at the time. Yeah, we got better versions, but you know what I'm saying. Kind of looking at the history of it. So I appreciate you guys stopping in. I thought it would be pretty cool to check this game out. Smash that like button, subscribe, do all that wonderful stuff. Is this a game you're interested in? You know, drop a comment down below. Is there a game you want me to peep out and share with you guys for, you know, any specific system? Throw a comment out there. I'm always open to suggestions. And with that said, guys, I will catch y'all next time. Peace out. Bye-bye. Boom.